So I think I'm going to go ahead and get started so we have enough time at the end for some discussion. So my name is Courtney McNamara. I'm chair of the Trade and Health Forum, and it's my real pleasure to welcome you to today's event, which is focused on the question of how far a patent waiver for COVID-19 medical products would go towards achieving global vaccine equity. Now, we're lucky to have with us tonight two leading experts on intellectual property rights in the context of COVID-19, Deborah Gleeson from LaTrobe University and Rachel Silverman from the Center for Global Development. Now, before I introduce the speakers, I just want to spend a couple of minutes introducing the Trade and Health Forum for those of you who might be unfamiliar with our group. So in short, the Trade and Health Forum is a member group of the American Public Health Association, or APHA. And really our members are dedicated to conducting research and increasing the visibility of issues that intersect with trade and health. Undertake various activities throughout the sorry, could everybody mute themselves? So we undertake various activities throughout the year to facilitate this, like today's event. I guess we're all over the world. Every year, we also organize at least 2 scientific sessions at APHA's annual meeting. Now, this year's annual meeting is just in a couple of weeks' time, and our scientific sessions are going to focus on how trade intersects with health systems and the social determinants of health. Now, we have a great lineup of presenters this year, and the conference will be held both in person in Denver and online. So if you're interested, do take a look at this year's program, and this is available on APHA's website. Now, you can also join us at our virtual business meeting that we'll hold at the annual meeting. And we really use this as an opportunity to meet with other trade and health researchers and to network among ourselves. And this is also typically at these meetings, this is when we typically start making plans for the sort of activities that we'll undertake in the following year. Now, if you'd like to receive updates about the forum's activities, you can join our listserv at this link here. And I'll just give you a second to jot it down. And you can also contact us through this email, tradehealthforumapha@gmail.com. And you can follow us on Twitter at APHA Trade. So again, our speakers tonight are Deborah Gleeson and Rachel Silverman. They'll each have about 15 minutes to present. And then my colleague, Eric Crosby, who's a program planner for the forum and who organizes all these scientific sessions at the annual meeting, will moderate any questions you might have for the speakers after both of them have presented. So up first is Deborah Gleeson. And Deborah is an associate professor in the School of Psychology and Public Health at LaTrobe University in Australia. Her primary interest area is on the impact of international trade agreements on public health and access to medicines. She's published extensively in this area, including over 70 scholarly articles. And her most recent book is titled Trade Agreements and Public Health, which she wrote together with Professor Ronald Labonte. So now I'm going to hand over to you, Deb.
Thanks very much, Courtney, and thank you to the Trade and Health Forum for inviting me to speak today. I'll just put my slides up on the screen. Can everyone see my title slide there?
Yep, it looks good.
Great. Okay, so I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm speaking, which is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. And I'm going to speak today about the proposed TRIPS waiver, what it is, why we need it, and why its opponents are wrong. So I'll start with TRIPS, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, so I won't spend much time on that. I'll give you a very brief history of the TRIPS waiver proposal, and then I'll focus on the revised proposal that was put forward in May 2021. I'll talk about implementation, make the case for the TRIPS waiver, debunk a few of the myths, and talk about why the TRIPS waiver is necessary but not sufficient. So as I'm sure all of you know, the World Trade Organization's TRIPS agreement requires WTO members to provide minimum standards of intellectual property protection, which include patents on products and processes of at least 20 years. And there's a slew of other intellectual property protections covering other types of intellectual property. And the TRIPS agreement, of course, has an important set of flexibilities, including compulsory licensing, which allows the exploitation of a patented product or process without the permission of the patent holder. And the requirement to attempt to negotiate a voluntary license first can be waived in certain circumstances, which include national emergencies or other circumstances of extreme urgency. And this is an important safeguard that has allowed countries to provide access to medicines for their populations for HIV, AIDS drugs, some cancer drugs, and so on, in situations where there are not affordable options available. So the TRIPS waiver, obviously a waiver of certain provisions of the TRIPS agreement for COVID-19 health products and technologies, was first proposed by India and South Africa just over a year ago on the 2nd of October 2020. And over the ensuing months, it gradually gained the support of more and more WTO members. And by March this year, it was over 100 members in support of the proposal, although many wealthy countries were still opposed to it at that point. The future of the TRIPS waiver proposal didn't look terribly bright until the US announced support for a waiver for vaccines and surprised the world in May 2021. So the US support was only for a limited waiver applying to vaccines, but that was still quite a game-changing development because the US, of course, has been the world's sort of staunchest defender of intellectual property rights and has lobbied other countries very hard to increase their intellectual property rights for pharmaceuticals. Shortly after that, the EU put forward a counter proposal, which focuses mainly on compulsory licensing, voluntary mechanisms to increase production, and issues around export restrictions. So the EU proposal is seen by access to medicines advocates as not really shifting the status quo anywhere near sufficiently to actually increase the production, global production of vaccines or other COVID-19 medical products. The co-sponsors of the TRIPS proposal put forward a revised decision text on the 21st of May this year, which was sponsored by 63 countries. And this proposal clarified the scope and duration of the TRIPS waiver, and we'll focus on that for the rest of the presentation today. By the 10th of June, the WTO members agreed to move forward to text-based discussions, but since then things haven't progressed very far. The EU and particularly Germany remain strongly opposed to the TRIPS waiver, and the UK and Switzerland remain opposed, although some other countries, including my own country, Australia, have shifted to swing their support behind the TRIPS waiver, although there hasn't been much movement in terms of more countries formally supporting the proposal. So discussions at the TRIPS Council have been ongoing, and the next TRIPS Council meeting is on the 13th of October, but it's still at the moment in a state of stalemate. So the revised proposal, as I said, clarifies the product scope and also the scope of the intellectual property rights. and the duration of the proposal. So it would apply to all health products and technologies to prevent, treat and contain COVID-19. So I think people often think about vaccines when they think about the TRIPS waiver, but it would also apply to therapeutics, diagnostics, devices like ventilators, for example, and personal protective equipment. But not just the finished products themselves, also the materials or components and the methods and means of manufacture, which is really important because all of those things can be covered by patents and other intellectual property rights. So the scope in terms of intellectual property rights of the waiver is for the application, implementation and enforcement of TRIPS provisions on copyright, industrial designs, patents and protection of undisclosed information such as trade secrets, which is really important, particularly in the context of vaccines and biotherapeutics, where a lot of the detailed information about the production process can be protected as trade secrets. And the co-sponsors of the proposal clarified that they want the duration to be 3 years from the date of decision, and that after that date, it should be annually reviewed by the General Council, because of course, at this stage in the pandemic, we don't know how long countries will be needing these products for and how long the pandemic is going to continue. And importantly, measures taken in relation to the waiver won't be able to be challenged through the WTO's dispute settlement mechanism. So recently, the co-sponsors put forward a communication to the WTO, which also discussed how they would see the TRIPS waiver being implemented. So they said in this communication that the diversity of legal systems means that national implementation will vary, and decisions regarding implementation are intended to be left to each WTO member to decide. And depending on a country's legal system and the arrangements that it has in place for COVID-19, there's a number of different ways that countries could implement the waiver, including using the types of emergency powers that they've used for other COVID-19 issues like lockdowns and border controls, for example, disaster management legislation, which some countries such as India have in place, or they could make amendments to their national intellectual property legislation to implement the waiver. So I'm going to talk briefly about the case for the waiver in terms of inequities in access to COVID-19 medical products, vaccine nationalism, the failure of COVAX, and give you some examples of the intellectual property barriers that countries are experiencing. So many of you will be familiar with this information already, but by November last year, countries accounting for 14% of the global population had pre-purchased around 51% of the first 7.5 billion doses. And that really kind of set the inequities in place that we're now seeing playing out through the pandemic. And by August this year, 80% of the doses that had been administered in high and upper middle income countries 80% of the doses that had been administered were in high and upper middle income countries. And the WHO noted that high income countries averaged 1 dose per person, whereas in low income countries, it was 1.5 per 100 people. It hasn't moved very much from there since that time. High income countries are now stockpiling vaccine doses for booster shots. And even after boosters have been administered, the kind of supply in high-income countries may mean that there's more than 1 billion doses left over by the end of 2021, even after these boosters have been administered. And high-income countries are now engaging in a lot of, kind of swap deals. So, for example, Australia has bought doses from Poland that were close to expiry and has swapped doses with the UK and Singapore. But there's not enough going to low-income countries. It's not only vaccines that are the problem. Therapeutics, of course, are becoming more and more important and will probably play a greater role as we go forward with the pandemic. And we're now seeing monoclonal antibodies coming onto the market, which might be quite effective in treating COVID-19, particularly in severe cases or people who are likely to progress to severe cases. And one example is the antibody cocktail produced by Regeneron, which became famous when President Trump took that. And these monoclonal antibodies are priced very highly, and we're likely to see the sorts of inequities that we've seen with vaccines replicated in terms of therapeutics. Diagnostics are also an issue, with the TRIPS waiver co-sponsors noting in their recent communication that there are at the moment an average of 603 tests per 100,000 people in high-income countries, whereas there are around 5 per 100,000 in low-income countries. So I'm sure you've seen graphs like this before. This comes from a paper in the British Medical Journal in December last year, showing the pre-market commitment in terms of COVID-19 vaccine reservations. So per person, the number of doses that have been reserved by key countries by around November last year. And you can see Canada there at the top at around 5 courses per person, with Australia not too far behind. And Australia's now caught up with Canada. We've now ordered a total of 280.8 million doses for our population of 25.9 million people, which equates to 10.8 doses per person. These are all 2-dose vaccines, so that's just over 5 courses per person. Of course, you would have heard that Australia is in quite a crisis at the moment, because although we've ordered a lot of doses, we have also had a lot of supply issues, and we're quite far behind most other OECD countries in terms of vaccinating our population. Australia has made a number of donations. We've donated 130 million through the COVAX AMC for low and middle income countries. And we've made quite a lot of donations of both funds and vaccine doses to other countries in our region. These types of bilateral donations are a bit of a problem, though, because of course COVAX has been set up as the mechanism for equitable distribution of vaccines, but many countries are donating according to their own national interest rather than through COVAX, where they're distributed according to need. These donations, a lot of these donations are possible because Australia is manufacturing the AstraZeneca vaccine onshore through our company CSL. And of course, Australians, the demand from Australians is dropping off for the AstraZeneca vaccine now that we have other vaccines available. And so we're able to make vaccines for other countries in our region. So the sort of gap that was predicted last year, once countries had put all these pre-purchase agreements in place, is now really coming to fruition, and is getting wider in terms of the vaccination rate in high income versus low income countries. And I'm sure you've all seen graphs like this. So part of the picture also is the failure of COVAX, which initially aimed to deliver 2 billion doses by the end of 2021, which would be enough to vaccinate 20% of the population in 92 low-income countries. But of course, COVAX has been, its aim's been frustrated by all of these pre-purchase commitments that high-income countries have made, as well as issues with production, export restrictions, and so on. And COVAX wound back its forecast to around 1.4 billion doses in September. But by today, less than 338 million doses have been delivered. So although COVAX looked like a really promising mechanism at the beginning of the pandemic, it really hasn't realised its promise. So I'll just talk through a couple of examples of the intellectual property barriers. And one example is the medication remdesivir, which appeared very promising in the early stages of the pandemic, although it hasn't sort of realised its promise in terms of reducing hospitalisations and deaths. So Gilead Sciences, which manufactures remdesivir owns patents in more than 70 countries and priced a 5-day course of treatment at $2,430 for US government purchases and other high-income countries. But the cost of production has been estimated at around $1 per day. And the development of this drug was underpinned by at least $70.5 million in public funding. Gilead did negotiate voluntary licenses with companies in India, Pakistan, and Egypt, but these licenses limited exports to 127 mainly low-income countries, leaving out middle-income countries such as China, Mexico, Brazil, and so on. And the US government bought up almost all of the first 3 months' supply, leaving many countries unable to afford the prices that Gilead was charging, but also unable to secure cheaper versions of the drug. IP barriers are also very important when it comes to vaccines. And this is a network analysis diagram from a paper in Nature Biotechnology published earlier this year, just showing the complex network of patents and license agreements underlying these technologies, which just shows you some of the complexity and the difficulty that countries would face if they tried to use compulsory licensing in this area in such a complex field. The pharmaceutical industry has really failed to negotiate sufficient voluntary licensing agreements to ramp up the global supply, and has so far refused to share technology and know-how through the WHO's COVID-19 technology access pool. So this table comes from a recent MSF briefing note showing the licensing deals that have been negotiated for mRNA vaccines. And you can see they're all in high-income countries, with the exception of China, and all of the requests for licensing agreements from low and lower middle income countries have been refused to date. So now I'm just going to address a few of the main myths that circulate about the TRIPS waiver. So the first myth, which we hear really often, is that intellectual property is necessary to stimulate innovation. But of course, the normal market dynamics don't apply when it comes to pandemics. And the development of COVID-19 vaccines and other products has been underpinned by massive injections of public funding. And MSF reported in November last year that the 6 front-running vaccine candidates had had a total of over $12 billion of taxpayer and public money poured into them. The projected revenues of the leading pharmaceutical companies are enormously high. So Pfizer is now predicting that it will bring in $33.5 billion in 2021, and Moderna $18.4 billion. Another myth is that there's insufficient manufacturing in low and middle income countries, that even if the intellectual property rights were waived, manufacturing capacity is not there and couldn't be scaled up quickly enough. But actually there are very established vaccine manufacturers in many parts of the world. And examples are that there are at least 7 accredited manufacturers in Africa with capacity to make mRNA vaccines. And the Pan American Health Organization has recently selected centres in Argentina and Brazil with the capacity to produce these vaccines. We often also hear that intellectual property is not the real issue, it's the problems with the supply chain. So even if we solved the intellectual property issues, manufacturers wouldn't be able to obtain the raw materials that they need to make vaccines and other products. And shortages of raw materials are certainly a part of the problem, but actually waiving intellectual property rights would help address this issue because IP rights contribute to these shortages of raw materials. And an example is the plastic bioreactor bags that are used in vaccine manufacturing, which are produced by a small number of companies, and they're very heavily protected by patents. And importantly, the IP waiver that's being proposed would apply to these types of barriers, not just the finished products. We also hear, particularly from the EU, that compulsory licensing will do the job. That will be enough. We've already got a mechanism that works and we can simply engage that. But compulsory licensing only applies to patents, not the trade secrets protection, which covers a lot of the manufacturing processes and detailed know-how about how to make the vaccines. And compulsory licensing is a difficult tool to use in circumstances like this. It's time consuming and onerous to use. It would need to be applied for on a case-by-case, product-by-product basis. Countries that use compulsory licensing generally face intense pressure from high-income countries where the pharmaceutical companies are based. And we haven't seen it really successfully used so far in the pandemic. So Bolivia recently notified an intention to use compulsory licensing to import COVID-19 vaccines from a Canadian company, BioLice, which was very happy to make them, but the Canadian government has refused to issue a license, and so that hasn't gone ahead. So just to finish up before I hand over to Rachel, the TRIPS waiver is a really important part of fixing the issue of the limited global supply of vaccines and the inequitable distribution of vaccines, because it would enable companies to freely produce the covered health products and use the technologies without fear of litigation over IP infringement. And it would also provide leverage to encourage the type of cooperation that we haven't yet seen so far from the pharmaceutical companies towards other solutions like voluntary licensing. But of course, an IP waiver wouldn't be enough on its own. It's only part of the puzzle. And we need urgently, we need countries to donate more funds and more products to low and middle income countries. And we need them to put pressure on pharmaceutical companies to share their intellectual property, technology and know-how. And conditions really need to be attached to the funding that countries are putting into the pharmaceutical industry for these products. And we need massive investment in manufacturing capacity in low and middle income countries to rapidly scale up manufacturing once the intellectual property rights are freed up. And I'll hand over to Rachel now to take you through her points. Look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Deborah. All right, I'm going to try and share my screen. One moment, please.
While you do that, Rachel, I'll just introduce you.
Okay.
So Rachel Silverman is a policy fellow at the Center for Global Development, and here she leads policy-oriented research on global health financing and incentive structures. And before joining the center in 2011, she worked with the National Democratic Institute, and she holds a Master of Philosophy with distinction in public health from the University of Cambridge, where she attended as a Gates Cambridge Scholar. Over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Courtney. Okay, so I think Deborah gave quite a lot of useful background, so I'm going to try and pick up on that. You know, I think I agree with her on a lot. I think maybe I have a slightly different perspective on some of this. I will also just say up front, this is a very fluid situation. So the discussions are still ongoing. It's sometimes quite difficult to track what's happening with vaccine donations and deliveries and the up-to-date issues. It's all happening quickly. But so, you know, a month from now, the issues might look totally different. Certainly, I was revising some old slides from a few months ago and I was like, oh, these are very out of date. So all that just as a little bit of context. Okay, so I think one common thread here is the case for vaccine equity is very important. It's above all a moral imperative that we need to save human life from preventable deaths and ongoing mass casualty events. We have a tool that can do this. We should execute it. That's just a universal moral human imperative. We also have a self-interest in this as wealthy countries, or really as any country in the world. To the extent that there's ongoing circulation, that's going to lend itself to new variants, immune escape, potentially reimportation, global instability, and also just a slower economic recovery, which has trade, travel implications. We all sort of benefit from free movement of goods and free movement of people to some extent, at the very least. And then there's a diplomatic imperative, also kind of self-interest, but allowing this sort of inequity to foster will lead to pretty justified global resentment of the West, potentially allow inroads for Chinese and Russian overtures and donations. I think that's something that politicians in Washington, for example, worry a lot about. Okay, and as Deborah was saying, there are striking inequities in vaccine access. Now, this chart is from our World in Data, shows the percent of people who have received at least one dose of a COVID vaccine in different countries. And this is one of the places where actually things look pretty different if you start looking, if you stop your analysis in mid-May versus now. One thing that's happened in the interim is that a lot of the middle income countries are closing the gap fast. So Brazil, despite their anti-vaxxer president, has exceeded the EU and United States vaccination rates for at least one dose. Mexico, Peru, other Latin American countries are at around 50%. India is approaching 50%. But then if you look way down at the bottom, you see that most African countries in particular are still hovering between about 2 and 5% vaccine coverage. And it is a different picture than we were seeing in May. In May, we really saw that only rich countries had any access to vaccines. And now what we're seeing is almost all countries have some access to vaccines, except most of the African continent. And they were the countries that were primarily relying on COVAX, which has really struggled. Next slide, please. Oh, I am controlling the slides. Just kidding. Okay, so what's going on here? Like I said, it's a very fluid, complex situation. So on the one hand, we have the Biden administration has announced donations of 1 billion Pfizer shots to low and middle income countries. Now, let's say all of that went to Africa. That would be on its own more than enough to vaccinate the entire eligible population in sub-Saharan Africa, more or less. We have COVAX really struggling. That's related to the Indian, it's a long story. It's related to many things, but in part due to Indian exports. And we really have African countries sounding the alarm, saying they still do not have vaccines, they're being left behind and they need them. Next slide. Okay, so what's happening here? Well, there are several problems at once. So the first is that, as Deborah was talking about, Western countries really bought their way to the front of the line before there were any vaccines via advanced purchase agreements. And now they're using the scarce global supply to offer booster shots, to set aside for potential future boosters, to stockpile, and to vaccinate children, all before there are still first doses to high priority populations in low income countries. So we have a certain amount of supply. It's not necessarily being used in the most efficient way right now to cover and help the most people. Middle income countries also eventually contracted directly with vaccine manufacturers, although there was a delay, and they're now scaling rapidly. Problem 2, and this gets to the kind of vaccine. Global production is relatively tilted towards the Chinese, Russian, AstraZeneca, and J&J vaccines. A lot of these vaccines are quite good at preventing illness and death. However, increasingly, it seems that the mRNA vaccines are more desirable, that they have potentially more robust efficacy, that they are easier to update, that maybe they perform better against some emerging variants, against Delta. And we are potentially entering a situation of 2-tier vaccination, where the West gets the best vaccines and maybe only allows some of those vaccines for global travel. So this has been a big controversy in the UK, for example. Problem 3 was the India export freeze. So COVAX and poor countries were really counting on India to supply all their vaccines. India said they could do this through their generic manufacturers who had, in particular, the Serum Institute, which had a deal with to produce the AstraZeneca vaccine. However, when India had its own national crisis, this led to a freeze of exports for 6 months. And that basically completely dried up supply to COVAX in African countries for that period. Good news is that it sounds like that export restriction is going away next month, but obviously in the interim, it's been a very bad situation. All right, there's also a lot of unpredictability and growth in aggregate demand. So at first, people thought, well, maybe we only need 1 or 2 vaccines each. Now, increasingly, countries are thinking we'll need regular boosters and modifications. So even though supply has scaled very quickly, demand has continued to exceed supply. Now, at the same time, I think manufacturers sometimes nevertheless don't feel that there's clarity about what the market will look like and whether it's worth them pursuing further scale up or development due to commercial uncertainty. So Sanofi recently announced that it was abandoning a promising mRNA candidate because it didn't see necessarily a commercial opportunity for it. And problem 5, and this gets us to the TRIPS waiver and also these supply issues, is limited sharing and dissemination of the know-how and license to produce the vaccine, especially for mRNA. So this is the legal right to produce the vaccine, the patents and licenses. There's the actual know-how and recipe, the tech transfer that will allow you to produce it. And it's pretty clear that Pfizer and Moderna are dragging their feet on tech transfer and licensing while also prioritizing existing supply to richer countries. You know, they're really not helping their image here in their behavior, let's put it that way. Okay, so what would a TRIPS waiver do? So what a TRIPS waiver would do, and I think Deborah explained it well, is that it would suspend international obligations under TRIPS over patents and other IP on COVID-19 technologies. It is probably temporary, although it would sort of need to be revisited. There is not necessarily a clear end date. It does not necessarily trickle down to country level IP laws and protection. So, South Africa, for example, has its own suite of IP laws. They would still need to do something about local IP laws to ignore a locally filed patent, for example. Just waiving the international TRIPS protection does not necessarily have any impact on national laws. It may allow regulatory agencies to release some proprietary trade secrets, those that would be contained in the dossiers. It would not on its own compel technology transfer or cooperation from originator companies. And this is very important with regards to vaccines. So if you think about a normal drug, small molecule drug, it can be reverse engineered. You can look at it, you can say, okay, what's the composition of this drug? What's the chemical compound? How can I figure out how to synthesize this chemical compound? And now I can make it. And I can make it and I can sell it so long as there are no IP laws that prevent me from doing that. Vaccines and other biologics don't really work that way. Just because you observe the technology and just because you have the legal right to make it does not mean you're able to figure out how to make it and then make it for yourself. So it becomes very difficult to do without the technology transfer and the cooperation from originator companies. And even if you could take enough information from the dossiers, the trade secrets, to figure out how to make your own approximation of it, it would still be a different vaccine because it would not be exactly the same. And you could not show the equivalence of the chemical compound. So you would have to do your own trial, send it through its own regulatory approval process. You could not just say, okay, this is the same vaccine and it's just a copy and we want it to go out originally, immediately. So if you don't have the cooperation and the tech transfer from the originator companies, it's really hard for this alone to get you to actually producing vaccines. But this is a pretty fraught history. And IP, the TRIPS agreement, patents have long been an activist versus industry flashpoint. There's a long-standing battle between industry and the global South and health advocates about patents and access to medicines. Patents by design restrict generic competition. That's what they are designed to do. They keep prices higher than they would be in a competitive market. They have often led to restricted access for innovative medicines. The HIV pandemic is sort of the most notable example of this. And even industry has issued a mea culpa for this and said their behavior was, I think the word was regrettable. But it's kind of widely understood how terrible this was. But I would say advocacy groups in general, they also more broadly challenge the role of patent exclusivity on all medicines. They prefer delinkage between the cost of medicine and incentives for innovation, and prefer other non-patent forms of financing. And even before there was a vaccine, they had begun a pretty robust campaign against a profit vaccine, against patents in a pandemic, saying that we should have a people's vaccine. It should be available to everyone. It should be free to produce, no IP, affordable for all. So as Deb was explaining, this semi-culminated in a statement of support from Ambassador Tai for a limited version of the COVID TRIPS waiver. This was met with great celebration and elation from, I'd say, the advocacy community, who sort of thought this day would never come, that the US would be forever a very strong backer of patents and IP, siding with the drug companies. However, I will note the date on this announcement, May 5th, 2021. That was over 5 months ago. And 5 months later, we are still arguing about potential TRIPS waiver at the WTO. I guess I have the hypothesis, although others might disagree, that kind of the US support for this and the kind of applause it received from activists for doing this reduced the pressure for it to take other more immediate actions to support countries in addressing the pandemic. Tech transfer has now emerged as a major flashpoint, I think appropriately so. It has pretty immediate relevance for scale up. Pfizer and Moderna continue to drag their feet on this. There is the WHO effort to have an mRNA tech transfer hub, but so far no one is participating. We're seeing major progress on vaccine coverage in middle-income countries, but low-income countries still left behind. And with the rise of Delta, I think we're all kind of confronting the impossibility of full containment, that we're going to need to transition to endemic disease and management. That will probably entail regular boosters and updates. And it might require continued innovation. It's not that we have vaccines, they're great, we get them, and we never have to worry about COVID again. We might need more effective vaccines. We might continue to need other tools to be developed. So some big picture takes. It's a very fluid situation. Pharma's gonna pharma. I saw someone say that on Twitter a while ago, and I thought it was very apt. Pfizer and Moderna are not exactly covering themselves in glory with their approach to global equity. They obviously feel that they've gotten a lot of good press, and I think it's unfortunate that they can't do the right thing here, but I guess maybe not that surprising. I think from my perspective, it's a bit different if you look at the therapeutics like remdesivir. But in general, the TRIPS waiver is just not well suited to what I'd call the shape of this problem, of vaccine equity specifically, given the difficulty of reverse engineering. The waiver has not moved forward. I think, again, I have kind of the hypothesis that it might have been a distraction from more actionable approaches, and not necessarily like nicer to pharma actionable approaches. One thing we could have done, for example, is to coerce tech transfer under the Defense Production Act. We have not really done that. That said, there has been pressure on pharma that probably has been useful to motivate voluntary action and donations. So the fact that there have been these sustained campaigns for vaccine equity, I think, have helped in that way. And maybe we'll get some long-term traction in regional tech transfer. It seems to have gone pretty high up the agenda. it seems like even kind of BioNTech is biting a little bit on the idea of expanding tech transfer into Africa, for example. We'll see how it goes. But I'd say those would be the big upsides. So I guess my overall take is I neither think it's useless symbolism nor sort of a fundamental step forward in vaccine equity. I think it touches on a number of very important issues around vaccine access. Unfortunately, I don't think it has the waiver per se versus the broader campaign for equity, affordability, and access. I'm not sure has necessarily pushed the ball forward. And unfortunately, there is no waiver yet. Now, but I also want to be clear, I'm not really an opponent of the waiver. If the waiver was here tomorrow, I think it would be fine. I don't think it would make that much of a difference, probably more so on diagnostics and therapeutics than on vaccines. I think the concern I've always had is the prioritization of advocacy. And are we targeting the things that are most likely to make a more immediate impact? So with that, I'll wrap up and go to Courtney.
Thanks so much, Rachel. And thanks also to Deb. Thanks to both for really interesting, really informative presentations. Now I want to save as much time as possible for participants to ask questions. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Eric Crosby now. Eric, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you. Yeah, so thanks again. Great job, both Deb and Rachel. We are, grateful that you were able to speak, and especially at this time period. So as a reminder, I'm Eric Crosby. I'm the program chair for the Trade and Health Forum. And then we do have time for some discussion. So I do see some hands that are already put up. So I think Stan, I saw your hand up. So why don't you go ahead and ask your question? Thank you.
I thought the presentations were great. Thank you very much. One of the points made was that it looks like we're coming into a two-tier situation with the mRNA vaccines being more popular and the other vaccines with older technologies less. And this is a question for either Deborah or Rachel, I guess. If you were, queen for a day or in charge of the world, which in your target, if I get this right, for equity is sub-Saharan Africa, which vaccine or categories of vaccine would you choose to produce, if all the procedural issues were settled?
I can offer my answer to this. So I would want mRNA vaccines, but I guess there's two issues. One is the immediate question of addressing the COVID pandemic. And the other is more of a long-term play towards supply security, local manufacturing, preparedness, and resilience in other regions of the world so that they're not in the future in a position where they have to rely on donations or leftovers after trade restrictions are removed. If it were for the purpose of controlling the pandemic, I would probably say anything. The cheapest thing to get out there as quickly as possible. I think, Johnson & Johnson's decent, AstraZeneca's decent, Novavax looks pretty good. I would say anything. I think I think a lot of where the conversation is now, though, is really about mRNA, because there is a belief that there is a long-term play there and the stakes are higher than just COVID vaccines, because the stakes are, on the one hand, does Africa, does South Asia, does Latin America, do they have their own capacity to produce mRNA products in response to a new pandemic, for example, which can be done quite quickly. And on the other side, you have Moderna and Pfizer, who, yes, received a lot of public money, yes, have gotten a ton of public support, nonetheless have developed these platforms. They see them as having many different commercial applications, not just COVID vaccines. And they're being asked to kind of relinquish their control over these platforms. So I think we're having a little bit of a proxy fight over that longer term question, and it's being focused now on COVID vaccines, but I think that's in some ways not what it's actually about when you're talking about mRNA specifically.
Great, thanks, Rachel. And Deb, do you want to add anything to that?
Yes, thanks, Eric. So I'll just add that there's a lot of effort going on now to try and get technology transfer of the mRNA vaccines. And I think Access to Medicines advocates haven't been sitting by just, hoping that things progress on the TRIPS waiver. There's also been a lot of work going on to try and get that technology transfer and put pressure on the pharmaceutical companies to make that happen. I think we also need diversity, though, in vaccines. We need lots of different options. And I think one important thing that the TRIPS waiver does is kind of frees up the field for more research and development, because that can happen without companies having to worry about, accidentally infringing intellectual property rights on platform technologies and raw materials and all sorts of things that are needed to actually innovate. So I think, while the focus is on mRNA vaccines now, and they do seem very promising, particularly because of the ability to quickly adapt them to new variants, I do think we need to be investing in lots of different options going forward.
Great, thanks, Deb. And then for others that have questions, please use the raise hand function. If you don't, we can speak, and then you can also use the chat box as well. But while you think of that, I just had a question for each of you, because I do think both of you guys were in agreement on a lot of areas, but I thought there was, some subtle differences. So I wanted to ask you about each other's thoughts and presentations. So I think I would, for you, Rachel, I wondered what you thought about kind of the end of Deb's presentation when she was talking a lot about these myths around, around IPs and how they stimulate innovation. And, there's also this myth about insufficient manufacturing capacity, because you had tied that part into yours. So I wonder what your thoughts are around those myths. And then Deb, I wondered what you thought about kind of Rachel's perspective on how this is a very fluid situation, which again, obviously is changing all the time. But, she mentioned about how there was freezes from India. There's a lot of unpredictability. There's some countries like Brazil that are catching up. So I just wanted what, your thoughts on what she was saying about the kind of fluidity, right? This is sometimes not always a black and white situation. It's changing. So Rachel, I'll start with you to see what you thought around some of those myths.
Yeah, so some I definitely agree with her are myths. The manufacturing capacity one it's a little bit complicated, right? I think I totally agree that there is unused manufacturing capacity with conversion, tech transfer that should be able to be deployed to make mRNA vaccines. I think there are a couple questions though. One question is okay, well, what needs to happen? What would the time frame be for those conversions? What are the capital investment needs for those conversions? Let's say that tomorrow there was tech transfer, free IP, everything. Is there actually the kind of commercial or have at various points in this pandemic, let me put it that way, because it's been fluid and things have been changing. Have there actually been the incentives and financing to do the capital improvements and investments you would need to start setting up the mRNA lines? I think the assumption I've sometimes seen has been oh yeah, they could sort of just do it. And, obviously they want to, so they could just start making it. I think that question of financing and the commercial incentives has been more of an issue than people have maybe acknowledged at certain times. Especially because, again, if you put ourselves in the mindset of, 4 months ago, when we thought the vaccines would be more long lasting, that we wouldn't need boosters, it was quite possible we'd have saturated the entire market and vaccinated all the people by mid 2022. So why keep investing in scale up? Now, that's not what's happening. So I think there is extra manufacturing capacity. It could be tapped, but there's some time frame to do it with. The incentives for innovation, I do worry about this. I mean, I guess at the margins, at least on COVID vaccines, I'm not that worried about it. I do think broadly speaking though, I just came back to the US after living abroad. I've been watching a bunch of drug addicts ads on TV for the most absolute marginal conditions. If you want drug companies to solve the world's biggest problems versus some cosmetic procedure that's heals 10% faster, you don't want to punish them for doing that. Now, that doesn't mean you want them to like reap infinity profits, but I do think these incentives between what do pharma companies actually decide to work on matter. And that can go in both ways, right? It can be both overpaying for things that are worthless and underpaying for things that are highly valuable.
Great, thanks, Rachel. So Deb, we'll go to you, and then Joel, and then Daniel.
I totally agree with Rachel that the situation is really fluid, and it's really tough to try and keep up with all of the developments. I probably spend 4 to 5 hours a week just trying to keep up with what's happening on a day-to-day basis in this field. So certainly a very rapidly moving situation, and things can suddenly become possible that weren't possible some time ago. And on the other hand, over the year that since India and South Africa first proposed the TRIPS waiver, in some ways things haven't changed, and we haven't seen much progress at all. I think where I differ from Rachel is in my I'm very skeptical about how much the US can actually shift the situation, although the Biden administration has made that big commitment for vaccine donations. I think that's going to trickle in quite slowly over a long period of time. It's not really going to solve the problem quickly at all. Whether the Biden administration can actually realise that goal. I think we've seen a lot of goals set during the pandemic. Whether there'll be the same issues as COVAX has experienced, we'll have to wait and see. And I think, whether the US would ever move towards coercive tech transfer is, there's a big question mark in that area. So I think it is an issue that really needs global cooperation rather than waiting for the US to step in and save the world. Although I know that's not what you argued, Rachel. Thanks.
Thanks, Deb. Okay, let's go to Joel and then Daniel. And then just to ask Deb and Rachel, you guys are okay? I know we're at the time, a couple minutes more for a couple more questions. You guys are okay with that?
Yeah, that's fine for me.
Great. Okay, Joel, do you want to go ahead and ask your question, and then we'll go to Daniel?
Sure, thanks. So my question goes to the role of governments and public institutions. And there are two questions sort of related. So the first one is, if there is going to be tech transfer and public and manufacturing in other places, should that tech transfer go to private for-profit companies, or should it go to governments to set up not-for-profit manufacturing facilities for vaccines and possibly for other products as they become relevant? And the second one is, given that this is going to be an ongoing problem, and that there are going to be other pandemics in the future, I'm rooting for a few in particular, but what should governments, and if governments are going to subsidize vaccine manufacturing or therapeutic manufacturing or device manufacturing for these future pandemics, what should be in the contracts that they, or what kind of demand should they place on the commercial entities that they contract with?
Okay, great. Thanks, Joel. So Deb or Rachel, either of those questions you want to address?
Perhaps I could take the second question there. Okay. I think that putting conditions in funding contracts is really vitally important, and that's something that we probably should have focused on pushing a lot earlier in the pandemic. And a big obstacle is that the contracts are non-transparent. They're not publicly available. We don't even know what's in a lot of these contracts, except when there are leaks. I think getting companies to commit to open licensing, to sharing technology and know-how through the COVID-19 technology access pool is really important. And getting the types of arrangements that we've seen with AstraZeneca, the AstraZeneca vaccine, is very important. I'll leave it at that because I know we're running out of time.
Yep. Rachel, anything else you want to add to that?
Yeah, on the first question, I mean, it's an interesting question. I'm pretty skeptical of the kind of central planning, state-owned enterprise type model for vaccine manufacturing. Obviously, though, there is a public interest in kind of what they do and you know, pricing, affordability, quality. I might like to see almost a regulated public utility model where it's sort of a little bit, you know, technically it's a private entity. It can make a profit, but within pretty strict parameters. Also, there's some interesting analogies around like paying for capacity. You know, if you want to basically have a subsidized capacity that can then be kind of scaled up when you need it, paying for capacity, then paying for kind of marginal output. So I think there's a lot of interesting literature on regulation of public utilities that would probably be a good model.
Okay, great. Thank you both. All right, Daniel, you had a question.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you both for your presentations. My name is Daniel Rangel. I'm with Public Citizens Global Trade Watch. I have one question that is directed to Rachel. I basically want to know your take on, I want to contrast a couple of things that you said, because you did say that the waiver would allow many regulatory agencies to release proprietary trade secrets, and that could help to actually the development and research for vaccines. And I totally understand what you meant by the difficulties of reverse engineering vaccines, but don't you think that acknowledging that contribution that the waiver will achieve will help out to achieve good results with the waiver, especially in vaccine development and production? And my other question is to either of you, and it's more of a research question. I don't know if someone has done the numbers of what's the new demand gonna look like, considering that a lot of countries that were using Chinese vaccines, now they want to use other kind of vaccines. And well, we have the booster programs in many high-income countries. So initially we said that maybe it was 11 billion, but probably the total demand is gonna change. And I was wondering if someone has an estimation of the number.
Okay, I can answer the first part. I don't have any estimation of that number. I mean, I've seen some data put out by trade groups, but I can't independently say if that's true or not. In terms of, you know, the dossiers and regulatory secrets, well, I'd say first, there's a couple of issues, right? One issue is that just because countries can release this doesn't mean they will. Again, TRIPS is about your international obligations, right? So if just because, all right, the US is no longer obligated under TRIPS to withhold trade secrets, it still has domestic laws that require it to withhold trade secrets. And that's going to be true of many different countries. Now, the people it will not be true of would be like the WHO, technically speaking, would sort of have its own kind of scope as a regulatory body. And it gets dossiers as part of the emergency use listing. That said, I would honestly be skeptical I would be surprised if the WHO ultimately did release that without the permission of the those submitting, because it puts them in a difficult position. They need companies to submit the dossiers to them to do the EUL, and companies are not going to submit to them if they believe all the trade secrets are going to be subsequently released. So I think it's possible this would happen, but I also think there's pretty interesting political dynamics at play. So I don't think it would necessarily lead to their release, but it could, depending on if one country that has dossiers decided to do so. But that country would incur a pretty high cost, because that country would then have difficulty getting other drugs registered in their country, because pharma companies would not want to submit the dossiers in the future.
Great, thanks, Rachel. Deb, do you want to add anything before we conclude here?
I'd just add that I think implementation is definitely going to be complex, and I think, you know, if we get agreement on the TRIPS waiver, there's a whole other set of problems that we then need to solve to implement it. But I would say that, you know, where there's a will, there's a way. You know, we didn't think we'd get this far with the TRIPS waiver. We didn't think the US would ever put support behind a waiver of any type. And the, you know, the types of responses that we've seen so far to the pandemic, and the, you know, the rapidity with which countries have addressed, you know, massive problems, and have mobilized, you know, legislative approaches to do things that would never have been, you know, we couldn't have imagined a few years ago, means that, you know, if countries, you know, have the will to do this, and we do get agreement on something at the WTO, then I think these are problems that can be solved.
Great, thanks, Deb. So I just want to thank you again to both of our speakers today, Rachel and Deb. Great presentations. Thank you for answering questions. And I assume that both of you can be contacted by email, right? If people have follow-up questions, right? So, you know, if anybody's interested in that, you guys may want to put your email in the chat or some further questions, and then I'll turn it over to Courtney to kind of finish up.
Thanks. I just want to thank both of our speakers again. Those really stimulating discussions. Thanks also to all the participants for some really interesting questions. Thanks to Eric for moderating. And I also want to give some thanks to the forum's secretary, Virginia Coetsias, and also the forum's former chair, Joshua Yang, both of which helped to organize tonight's event. So thank you everyone for joining us. And we hope to see you either at the annual meeting or on our listserv. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.